So welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And I'm talking today with Zach Schuster, who is both writer and artist of the comic THRUD. And I want to dive right into, Zach talking about THRUD. He did a very successful little Kickstarter for THRUD. And this book, by this point now, when you're listening to the episode, it has been published. It is out. THRUD is available directly from Zach Schuster. It is also available through the publisher Mythos and Inc. There's actually 2 editions of THRUD, so if you want to collect both sets. And I really recommend this book. And you can go to the description here for this podcast and find the direct links. I'm talking to Zach Schuster, and he's the author and illustrator, creator of THRUD. Zach, can you tell us a little bit about what THRUD is and sort of how you come to making comics?
THRUD is a collection of short Norse mythology-inspired stories. I've always loved Norse mythology and comics, and I wanted to make a project that I could post onto social media. So that's the square format. It's in a weird size, if you can see the book, 5x5. And Instagram posts really well when you do a square image. So I wanted to do something that I could bolster my social media presence on and actually just get myself drawing and working and just putting little stories. They're really, really short, 5 to 10 page stories. And so I could do a full story and get that full feeling of accomplishment every time I finished a single little kind of bit of it, which helped motivate me to get the whole thing out, which is fun.
You were originally posting them on Instagram in sequences?
In black and white, yeah. And it's all told out of order.
Galleries?
So, yeah.
Oh, in black and white?
You can post 10 images, I think, on Instagram as a max. And so that's what I did, a 10-pager, then a 5, then a 5, then a 10, then a 5. And I was hoping that would give the book some sort of rhythm. But yeah, it was a good challenge to kind of restrict the format size-wise and page count-wise, really make sure I was telling a full little story every time.
And you can talk a bit more about what the story is, and sort of who THRUD is, and sort of how that, when you say a Norse mythology inspired story, can you describe that a little bit?
I wasn't feeling too confident on my own as a writer when I went into this, so I wanted to deal with something that had a nice, rich background and lots of things I could change or add, but also draw from. Norse mythology is meant to be told and retold, and it's something I felt very comfortable in to just kind of experiment. So THRUD is kind of a mini Thor type, running around with a hammer, smashing bad guys and getting into mischief. And I was going for the Link and Navy kind of vibe from Legend of Zelda. It's such a good duo. It's not just Link and Navy. It's Hellboy and the Corpse, and you have like Agatha and Norgal from Headlopper. Just the silent, stoic kind of hero and the chatty partner. It's just such a tried and true character combination.
It's funny that you list all those influences, because my friend GMB Kamicha got me on, who has a illustration in your book here. He does provides sort of a last illustration where you have the guest artists, drawing THRUD and other characters in THRUD's world. So he got me turned on to Headlopper not too long ago. Nice. I had kind of slept on it originally, and then I've been a massive Zelda fan from back in the day.
Of course. Yeah.
And as you point out, you really THRUD is sort of this Thor-like female character. She actually has some of Thor's magical items in the story as well. Is this very kind of interesting, kind of powerful, kind of mythic sort of figure. But you created THRUD, correct? Like you weren't referencing a specific mythology.
Well, THRUD is the name of Thor's daughter in mythology.
Oh, okay.
And also a Valkyrie. It might be the same person. She's not in my comic actually Thor's daughter, but that kind of heiress to the throne kind of vibe I was going for.
Yeah, it certainly has that vibe of being Thor's daughter. That's interesting.
It's a throwaway line, but she's her Kvasir, my favorite Norse god, is her sidekick in this, and he even mentions when introducing her, she is silent, like the Link thing I was talking about.
Yeah.
He introduces, I don't know her real name, but I call her THRUD because she's rocking around with Thor's gear and it fits.
Is that part of the reason you had her kind of as a mute character? So you say you kind of almost inspired by the Link character, but is there any other kind of reason you started pulling that in?
I hadn't actually committed to having her all the way mute at the start of the stories, and then I wrote a couple over different points in time and went, okay, well, now we're committed.
It works
and it just kept
very
working.
well. Yeah.
I mean, the reason I think they do it in video games like Zelda is to insert yourself into the hero's perspective, because you're not saying something, they're not saying something you wouldn't say. They're not saying anything at all. You're just there being a hero, and it kind of lets you into the world a little bit more. And then that's what this chatty sidekick is for. They're talking to you then. And so it kept working, and I kept doing it. So
it's interesting you mentioned the video game influence, because the other book that it kind of made me think of a little bit was Scott A. Ford's Arkland. Yes, so it recalled Arkland to me a little bit, but maybe I couldn't quite pin down why. But I think it's sort of the video game vibe of it almost. Like you don't really have as strong a vibe in THRUD, but I do sort of see that influence now that you kind of stated.
I appreciate the comparison. Yeah, Scott's awesome.
Yeah, and it's the other thing I thought was really interesting about this particular story, because I never saw any of it in your original posts. Like I knew who you were because you had done work with my friend Lyndon.
Yeah.
But I'm not on Instagram doing stuff on Instagram.
Yeah, sure.
And so
that's why I was trying.
And so I became aware of THRUD first when you did a Kickstarter. And Lyndon's like, hey, you should, Zach's doing a Kickstarter. And it was like, and so I bought the book, and I was really impressed. So I didn't know anything about it till it showed up, in my hands, kind of thing. Other than I'd seen your other work, so like, I was just sort of I liked your other work,
sure.
And so I was really interested in your storytelling structure, because the specific thing that I find interesting as a kind of writer, and that I find interesting as a reader also, is unusual narrative structures. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about. Can you first off just describe sort of how you're telling the story in a bit more detail, and sort of how it loops back and sort of zigzags in that way, and sort of what drew you to that?
Well, the story, I'm telling it non-sequentially, because I was literally making it up as I went along, and then blasting out a comic in a couple days and then posting it and not letting myself edit, because I find I get bogged down by nitpicking and I just never finish putting a thing out. And so for this one, like if I post it, I'm locked in, that's it, no edits, let's go. And that was really good for me, and scary and fun. The way that popped into my head was an English professor I had at ACAD. I went to Alberta College of Art and Design a couple of years ago, and I had a teacher who on the first day, his name was Chris Fry, and he's a creative writer. And I walked into that first class going, this guy is nuts. Like he's Dead Poet Society, kind of standing on tables, yelling stuff, and I was going, oh, like, and I need an English credit, let's just get this through. And I walked, by the end of that class, first class with him, I walked out with a big smile on my face, and he taught me a weird amount about writing. His assignment, the first one we did that kind of went through the semester, was just like, hey, I need a small paragraph from a book, bring it in. And that was our homework for the first 4 weeks. And then on the 5th week, we went, okay, to put those in order, tell me your story. All of us in the class, without exception, had a fully formed story of 4 pieces of paragraphs we facetiously picked out, going, oh, here we go. Big man, teach me how to write a story. And it turns out, yeah, you can string a narrative out of anything. And that kind of really got me thinking about writing and how I would approach it. And turns out you can just make it up as you go along, and it kind of works, hopefully.
You also, though, of course, as you point out in the THRUD book, like she, the character, the speaking character, who's is a Quasir. Yeah. He talks a little bit about the actual storytelling structure at one point, and he references that it in some ways also is recalling the Nordic method of sort of telling part of a story and then leaving out the rest, the conclusion in some instances, leaving out a middle gap and skipping forward, this kind of, and then returning to fill in those gaps, or telling different versions of things. It's a storytelling structure that you see in Norse mythology. You see it to some degree in some indigenous mythologies, but you see like that kind of unusual structuring of like gaps and looping and skipping around in, as you say, nonlinear, kind of nonlinear storytelling.
For sure. That's partially because we just don't have a lot of that stuff. It was all passed down verbally until they wrote it down. And what we have written down has inconsistencies and a Christian slant in some ways, and just lots was lost. And like we know the names of a bunch of minor goddesses, and that's it. We don't even know what they were about. Like, or maybe we know what some of them are about, but that's it. Like we've lost so many things. which is what let me think I had lots of room to just kind of go with it and
sort of fill in the
fill in the
gaps
gaps
almost.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you also play with the whole the cyclical nature of kind of the Ragnarok structure.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is really just kind of curious or interesting to me, and I think something that is a lesson for artists and writers, is just your commitment early on to not only deciding to take on a project, but to posting it, like sharing it, and having these sort of cutoffs by which you had decided to share something. I'm curious to know just a bit more about what went into that decision. So before all this, what were you kind of doing? Like, what's your background as a as a comic artist?
I'm a pretty recent grad still. I graduated 2018, I guess it would have been. So I was just kind of getting going in terms of I want to start launching a comic career of some sort. I'm working part-time at a comic shop in town, Another Dimension, which is a great little shop.
Yeah, I used to live in Calgary, and I remember that shop well.
Nice. Yeah, I guess I'm not the new guy anymore as of very recently, but I was the new guy for 5 years, and it's been a really nice place to work and kind of meet local people with similar interests. That's how I found half the guest artists in THRUD, of which there were 16. I forgot to brag about that. That's the part I'm most proud of the book is there's 16 guest artists, and they're all phenomenal.
So you kind of were working on this comic store. You really kind of recently graduated in 2018, and then you decided at that point, were you kind of deciding to take on a larger project?
Yeah, I think by that point, Lyndon and I were kind of picking away at Hero Man, and I was working on a full board game. I did all the art for a card game called Drinking Quest with a friend of mine. He's at all the cons and stuff. I met him through the con circuit. And I didn't have time to do a full project, but I had the itch that I need to tell a story itch. And THRUD was really nice because I could blast out a story in a day or two and then put it aside while I brewed the next story kind of on the back burner. And then I could get my client work done. And then when I had another THRUD story ready, I could blast it out pretty quick again.
So this is an example of something I really like to talk about, because I call this podcast Writing the Wrong Way, and I kind of talk about writing the wrong way a lot. And the reason I do that is because I feel like there's this tendency that is writers and artists have to look at their situation, either their situation in life or their actual talent or ability, and they look at things that they're doing different from, say, the people that they admire, and they think those things are weaknesses. But often those things are like this weird strength that they have if they just sort of can drill further into it. So what I think is interesting about you taking on this particular project is, you're a guy who's looking like, maybe I don't have time, or like like I'm kind of new at this. I don't necessarily have the time or the feel of confidence to take on this massive 200-page project. But if you carve it up into these tiny little snippets, and if you don't worry about having a linear front to back story, you eventually kind of start to develop one. Like as people read THRUD, it does start to kind of develop, like, there is an end point to that story, and more or less, and it does sort of move towards a climax and so on.
Yeah.
But I can see very much like in some ways you're sort of taking like the things that maybe would stop somebody from doing anything, like not maybe knowing how to kind of do a story of that length, or not maybe having like or like a lot of people just perfectionist themselves into a corner where they just would go over things again and again and again because they've got 200 pages. They just keep going over them, as opposed to, I'm going to do 4, 5, 10 in
it won't get better unless you actually finish it. So I just told myself to finish it.
Yeah, I find it's a thing that really holds a lot of people up. So what compels you to, why did you do that though? Like, why did you actually get it to the point of putting it out there rather than sitting on it? Because so many people will sit on it. Like, what stops you from stopping yourself, I guess, is the question.
The big thing that got me going on THRUD originally, and what kept me going with that was, I wanted to post more to social media because my profile does not, I'm having a hard time getting traction on there. There's a lot of people out there doing a lot of cool stuff. But the big thing was I read the first couple volumes of Dragon Ball, and I'm not a big manga guy, but it's a really, like, before Z and all the space flying around and fighting, and that stuff's fun too. But the original stuff is a little boy going out on an adventure, and it's so clear that the writer was making it up as he went along, and it just kind of added charm and whimsy to the world. And if they wrote himself into a corner, he'd kind of drop something and just they'd go off somewhere else, find the Dragon Balls over here. It was just a really lighthearted kind of adventure. And I liked how I could just, the biggest vibe was, oh, he's making this up. I could do that. And that's what kind of got then with the Norse mythology as a backbone, I kind of went, yeah, okay, I'm going to get on that.
It's a magic moment when you first find the thing where you see that you think you could do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I remember distinctly when I was in high school, there was a moment where I watched the movie Clerks, which I don't know if people remember Clerks, but at the time, it was this big kind of indie hit. And it was the first movie where I watched it and then I stopped it and rewound it and watched it again. And I had the distinct, because I felt instantly like, oh, I could have made that movie.
Yeah.
Like I actually, just from maybe I didn't have necessarily, the wherewithal to do it, like, or the guts to do it, like,
sure,
put it on my credit card like Kevin Smith did. But, I could see like I had all those things were available to me. Like other than, I could have got the video recorder, I could have got, et cetera, et cetera. And it was and it was good, but it wasn't so good that it seemed impossible.
Yeah.
Like if I read Cormac McCarthy, I don't feel inspired, but if I read, there's like that weird, interesting level where if you just hit the right sort of level where it's exciting and fun, but you also think you could do it. It's an interesting moment, eh? Why comics though? Like what actually kind of what was your moment like that for comics specifically rather than something else?
For comics would have been, I liked superhero cartoons growing up. And I'm pretty young. I'm 25 now. I was just young enough to catch Teen Titans when it was airing. And I liked Robin a whole bunch. And I saw a ratty trade paperback at my library, the JLA special, A World Without Grown-Ups, when Young Justice is formed. And so that ratty old trade is like my prized possession, because I read that and looked at it and went, this is great. I could do this. And from then on, I started drawing a lot. I had always liked drawing as a kid, but that's kind of what went, oh, I could draw like this. No offense to Todd Knock or Ramos, whoever that was, but I saw that, went, oh yeah, this is attainable. And then since then, I've kind of always loved comics, and then got way into it, work in a comic shop, all that. But that was the book that went, yep, I can do this and I want to.
And now you took to Kickstarter to fund this book. So you'd already drawn all of it or most of it the point?
I think I had drawn all of it by then, yeah.
But in black and white, you hadn't colored it yet?
I had colored a large chunk of it by then.
Oh, okay. So what made you think of Kickstarter, and how did you prepare to do that?
I went to Europe after graduating and did a travel sketchbook that I printed myself and sold at small shows and cons and stuff. And I don't think I've broken even on that yet. And so for this one, I went, okay, if I start on Kickstarter, I want to have a thing that's easy to fund because it's already done. People trust for a first time that I'll have it delivered. And then in the future, that sets me up for maybe having a bit more breathing room to do a project and have money for it. But just as a first attempt at Kickstarter, I knew I wanted it mostly done before I launched it. But I wanted to make my print run back before I sold it, because it's so hard to make money in comics. As of now, I've almost broken even on THRUD. Even after the $3,000, I said I needed $1,000 to fund it, which was a lie. So all said and done, I printed more copies than I was going to, but I'm just about to break even. That being said, that's not including hundreds of hours of drawing it and writing it and
not counting your time. But
so it's
that's
a
impressive.
rough market for now, but it's a good start. I think next time I make a Kickstarter, I can probably do it a little more in advance and actually have some money to pay for the next project I work on.
You had initially set the Kickstarter goal around 1,000, if I recall, but then you overshot it to about 3,000 and change.
Yeah, I could have printed it all and shipped it for about 1,200 if I just printed 100 books. And then I figured if I got close to 100 people who wanted it, then I needed more than 100 books, and then my price break gets better, so I might as well shoot over that. And it's a numbers game at that point to figure out exactly how many I want to be stuck with in a year with no comic expos. I'm sitting on another almost 200 books, which isn't a lot for some people, but again, as someone who's just kind of starting out on the con circuit for myself and getting my own tables now finally instead of sharing, and I don't want to be stuck with too many, but I also wanted enough to make the price break worth it. And I've got a great local guy I'd like to shout out. Sam at Supreme Printing Limited has done the sketchbook I talked about and THRUD, and he did an exceptional job really quick.
While you're shouting things out, why don't you shout out where actually people can find this book? if they want to get a hold of THRUD? Because I just say you printed more than you needed for the Kickstarter, so you have copies to sell.
I'll be selling it at Another Dimension Comics, where I work there in Calgary, and I might reach out to other shops. But for now, I do also have a Big Cartel store that I'm just getting going, zmschuster.bigcartel.com. It's also on my website, zmschuster.com, links all over to that. So they're tied in. It's easy to get to if you can get to my site. Those are, for now, where I'm getting to.
Can you walk me a little bit through how you would come up with an idea for a THRUD story? Well, let's just maybe start with the character design a little bit. So as you mentioned, a few different characters you were kind of basing things on. At one point, you talked about Hellboy at one point, and at one point in your sketches, I noticed you had like some examples of early sketches. Then you have like a note beside one, like this glove looks too much like Hellboy's glove. You've got like, it's interesting to see some of the process in there. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the process of designing that character, and then also like a little bit about the process of putting her in a situation, like how you would kind of come up with a situation to put her in.
Yeah. The first couple sketches actually came out in my book. If you end up getting it, those first couple sketches that are in there are literally the first couple sketches. She came out pretty fully formed. I came up with the whole kind of story about a girl I wanted the gear of Thor outside of Mjolnir. I wanted the gloves and the belt that he's famous for too. I was originally going to not have the hammer at all. But it was too cool. I had to put it in. But my core idea was a girl in Norse mythology where Thor's supposed to be a redhead. I wanted a redheaded descendant of Thor, which she originally was going to be a descendant, with his gear, kind of collecting his gear in a post-apocalyptic kind of after Ragnarok world. If there was less magic items, then even his gloves and belt would be pretty hardcore. And so that first drawing I put out onto paper was pretty much what she ended up looking like. But that was the original idea, was just she has his gear, and she's a descendant, and everything sucks, and it's post-apocalyptic fun times.
And she's going around having adventures, and so
collecting treasure and fighting bosses, kind of Zelda, Dragon Ball, just that kind of idea.
So when you actually were to sit down to do your when you decide to start posting it, how did you decide on like what kind of schedule you wanted, and like how much time you're going to give yourself? Because a lot of times what I'll see with people do with this sort of thing is, like, I'm very much a believer in quantity begetting quality, and how you really need to focus initially on quantity first.
That's what I definitely agree.
Yeah, and I'm a firm believer in quality, but I think like people stop themselves from, say, putting stuff out. And like I was just telling my daughter this the other day, she was asking about writing, and I was like, the best thing you could do as a writer is get a blog and just post it every week.
Yeah.
And get used to, one, nobody reading your work. And two, doing it anyway.
Yeah.
But then what comes out in the wash of it all is the practice hours, right? And getting that kind of work in. Like when you're on that kind of schedule, you have to just find a kind of way to generate ideas. So what were some of your tricks that you would use to kind of come up with ideas for THRUD?
I read, first of all, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology and any other Norse mythology books and retellings I could get my hands on. I read some of the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, but it was a bit dry. The poems that are in the book THRUD are from a retelling by J.C. Jones in 1878, I believe. It's a 12-chapter book retelling the Norse myths in all rhyming meter, and it's awesome. And so I put little excerpts in there because it's public domain now. But I read a bunch of Norse mythology and kind of wanted to focus on the stuff we didn't hear about. So if I heard like a name that didn't have much of a backstory, I kind of put it in a journal and would poke at it or brew it, go for long walks, try to figure out what I could do there. And there's still a bunch of ideas that have now kind of turned into a volume 2, just because I never ended up getting these little bits. But like I got the name Odd as the giant she fights. Odd, I think, means greed, and he's a giant and he's a descendant of someone, and that's kind of it. Like that's kind of all we got. And I went, perfect. Need a giant. She's going to hit him. It's going to be cool.
Is he have a relation and a different spelling to Odd and the Frost Giants, like the Neil Gaiman book? I remember that. I don't remember what he's basing that on, but Neil Gaiman has another book, a short book called Odd and the Frost Giants. I believe it is an original fiction that he may or may not. I think he's basing on.
It's not on my radar somehow, and I should
check it out. So it was one of my daughters. Is my daughter's favorite book when she was in grade like 5 or 6. But it is a great little book. It's very small, and I don't know.
That sounds perfectly up my alley.
But yeah, it's called Odd and the Frost Giants, but they spell Odd ODD.
Okay.
And if you're kind of trying to search for it, but so I think that's a really interesting tactic to actually go find, the things that we don't know as well. Even just as you're saying with the character design, you were kind of focusing more on the gloves than say the hammer.
Yeah,
She doesn't get the hammer for some time. It's a very cool kind of approach because I think on one hand, it allows you to have enough of a framing context that you can skip around and jump around very fast and
yeah,
not necessarily, but still rely on the idea that like people know what Ragnarok is basically.
yeah,
Like if somebody's reading this, they probably have at least some vague idea what Ragnarok is.
yeah,
You don't have to over explain it. You can just kind of mention it and then, it's supposed to
yeah,
be Ragnarok and then skip ahead.
exactly.
Um, yeah, it's very curious. It's a very clever technique, and then at the same time, because you're not relying on characters that people do know a lot about, like they know a little bit about the world and the mythology, maybe, but they don't
Yeah.
know much about these people. Maybe nobody knows anything about these
And
people.
I might have very well gotten some stuff wrong, and I'm putting that in air quotes, wrong
Yeah,
about these stories again, because what we have might be faulty retellings from years, or the slant again from religion coming in, other religions coming in there. But overall, I didn't care that much if I ended up getting something wrong.
now you say you're doing some work on THRUD Volume 2 right now, or you have done a little bit.
Yeah, I've got a nice kind of script, not like full script, but chapter breakdown that I'm quite happy with. It's nice and cohesive and orderly, and actually has an ending worked out in advance this time. I'm really happy with it. It'll be another thing for me to experiment on. I feel like that's the next step for me is to practice, is telling a more linear story in the same universe.
Are you going to
Some of what I've
planning
set
to
up.
use the same sort of narrative structure, but just kind of in a more controlled or planned fashion, or are you going to break from that structure?
There's definitely more of a classic mythology journey. The main character will be her son Bragi, who's also, that name is taken from another Norse character, but
Hmm.
the god of poetry. But I want to do more where THRUD would solve something with a punch. He's going to try to trick his way through it, kind of more classically inspired. And then as chapter breaks, there'll be retellings of stories we didn't hear from THRUD and future stories, past stories, as kind of like a chapter break thing. So it'll have some of that flavor of making it up as I go along in between the beats of the main story, but it is more of a cohesive hero's journey type story.
I know you also do like work as an illustrator, for other writers, yeah, as opposed to just kind of writing and illustrating your own work. When you're
Yeah,
doing that, when you're working with a writer, I guess, as an illustrator,
yeah,
what is the sort of difference between how you like approach storytelling when you're doing a collaboration, or even just how do you when you are just doing work for hire?
yeah.
Like, what's the sort of way you treat those scenarios differently?
It depends on the person, because someone like Lyndon, who we both know, is my writer on a project I'm working on called Hero Man. I did a couple pages of that in his anthology with him, and now we're working on more of it. Lyndon's very good at backing off and letting me change things, and we'll talk and see what we both feel strongly about and what should stick and what we can, have wiggle room on. Again, it comes down to kind of money. If I'm getting paid lots of money by a client, yeah, I'll do it. Sure, let's go. I like money, hail capitalism. But when it's more of a collaboration, I like having that back and forth, the discourse that Lyndon and I can have about what scenes we feel are really important to get a book going. And then the final product is kind of the best of both of our visions. And I like that process more, but I also like money. So both work.
And what do you find is the mistakes that people make when they try to find an artist?
I've been
Like when people
kind of plugged
approach
in.
you.
Yeah, I entered that. There's a subreddit, comic book collabs, that I've been slowly weaning off of because originally I thought it was a good place for community to come, but it's mostly turned into people begging for free art for their precious Vision baby, and that's bad. That's not how you collaborate. Uh, I find that a lot of comic artists have ideas as well, so as a writer, you need to add a lot in order to get them on board, especially if you're trying for free. Um, you both have to be
Well,
excited about the project. So
the other thing I always caution people when they are, out there begging for free art for their vision babies. I love that phrase. But
might have been too rude, but I
no,
stand
that's
by it.
great. But the thing that those people don't realize, and they should realize, is that they want to pay and they want a contract saying they paid.
Mm,
Because what happens, well, a lot of people don't realize this, but like if if you decide to go free art somebody, all of a sudden you own half of their project.
yeah.
And they may not realize that. It happened most famously, of course, with The Walking Dead.
Yes.
Um, you know, not everything's The Walking Dead, but it can get very messy, and it costs you a lot sometimes to not pay somebody.
Yeah. But honestly, just at this stage in my career, at least, I'm just starting out and I need to make a lot of stuff to get better. I think my friend Riley always said 1,000 pages until you get good. And I haven't done that yet. So I want to make 1,000 pages and get a lot better. And I think I'm at the point now where, you just got to kind of blast it out. It can't be precious. You have to just stick to something and make it and move on to the next thing. And that next thing will be better, I hope.
What are some of the challenges that you're finding now that the cons have disappeared all of a sudden, like the way that they have? Because I know a lot of people are in this kind of boat that, I certainly am feeling like I'm in a little bit, though less so maybe than somebody like, my friend Gregory. He's in a different boat with the cons, but, whereas like I was trying to sort of move into establishing a kind of career in comics after kind of already having a bit of a career established elsewhere. Gregory, has got a very kind of solid career in comics established.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who are kind of, so, he's facing a lot of challenges, but, he is established. And so it's a little of a different scenario. You're in kind of that position almost sort of between the poles where like you have much more experience than I do in the comics scenario scene. But you're not certainly as well established as, say, Gregory might be. You're right in that position, I think, where you're not starting from scratch at all, and you've got this Kickstarter, for example, was a great solution in some respects to the con problem. But what are the other challenges you're sort of seeing with the cons disappearing, and how do you kind of trying to get around that?
I think for me, the big thing about cons is I haven't made a lot of money at them yet. But they've been invaluable for networking. Like Lyndon and I came up with our Hero Man idea while just chatting at a con behind his table. The people who taught me how to run a Kickstarter, Peter Chakowski, he's a webcomic guy who used to be from Toronto. Jason Anarchy, who does the Drinking Quest games. Like, it's just a really invaluable networking tool. Just even if you're not making money, get a table, sell your crap, talk to the people beside you. The networking is the biggest thing for me for cons until they start being money pinatas. Which I've heard about. I haven't gotten to that point yet. But for me, in a year without networking, that's a whole lot of missed opportunities and projects that aren't going to happen. And I think that's
well, there's certainly not money pinatas now for anyone.
No.
And, I still owed money now from the cons. So I'd put in for, tables. And I think a lot of people are in this weird scenario too, where they put in money for cons and they're not only are they not able to recoup that money, but they don't even necessarily want it back because, sometimes they're not being offered it back. And other times, it could easily become more expensive all of a sudden if the cons do come back, because they're going to be in potentially higher demand or potentially, it's just a lot of question marks. And I think the Kickstarter is an interesting phenomenon to see how it's worked for people. It doesn't always work for people. And so when you were kind of moving, again, as you're saying, you got, a bunch of advice going into the Kickstarter. What were some of the things that people were telling you and things that you found to be useful going into a Kickstarter? And what were some of the things that you maybe saw were challenging?
Yeah, the big thing for me was keeping it a realistic and attainable goal. I went through and looked at every comic project that was listed on Kickstarter in the weeks leading up to my campaign, which was a lot. And I checked out all the artists and writers and everybody involved, all their social medias to see their follower counts, which is way too much work because I could have looked at 3 of them and put it out. Almost everything on Kickstarter, comic related, hits $1,000, no matter what their goal is, with a couple notable exceptions that look like terrifying nonsense. But almost everything is hitting $1,000, and I went, okay, that'll be my goal, because then it'll actually get funded, and I can worry about the rest later. Even if I have to pay some out of pocket, that's better than my last book I did all on my own. Was my line of thought, and so I kept it attainable and didn't expect too much, and I was pleasantly surprised with how it ended up going. But yeah, just you want to make sure you're not losing out on money, and as a writer paying an artist, that would be even tougher for me, who had all the work done and everything kind of ready to go. It was easy for me to just shoot at a low goal and hope for the support. And I think that'll lead to a better next Kickstarter, and it'll keep building from there. People only want to back stuff that they think they're going to actually end up getting. So you want to make sure it looks nice and credible I mean, and is nice and credible, which is tough when you're starting out, I think.
And were there things that surprised you about the Kickstarter in terms of, in any sort of way, or something you didn't expect?
No, all the advice I got was pretty bang on. The first couple days are the most important. Then it hits a slow point, and then the last couple days are pretty good again. The third week, you're supposed to do about a month, and there's certain days you should start on. They tell you all in their Kickstarter when you're about to set it up. They tell you the best days and times and stuff. But yeah, that was pretty true. The third week was like no backers. That's fine. That's true on $20,000 campaigns, and that's true on smaller ones, it looks like. So it was all pretty much what I expected. I'm just pleasantly surprised that so many people I didn't know backed it, as opposed to just friends and family. That was nice and encouraging.
And how did you start spreading the word about it? Like, other than like initially starting with friends and family, was there any sort of thing you did in particular that you felt really helped you gain some traction?
Yeah, I got a lot of support from the comic shop where I've worked. I put up posters there, and I did social media, and I talked to some friends, an art dealer pal of mine, and some Peter and Jason, like I mentioned, just other people with networks and Kickstarter stuff, and asked them if they'd want to share the stuff around. So just again, using the contacts I made from cons and my work kind of helped me get that initial push.
Where do you think
That was it.
you're going to go after THRUD Volume 2? Or do you see yourself doing more with THRUD in that world going forward, or do you see yourself pivoting to a different sort of project, or where do you think you're kind of heading with THRUD specifically?
Well, I'm really enjoying reading or writing the volume 2 that I've got going. THRUD's got some more ass to kick. Some people, I had a friend say she was a little disappointed with the ending, just because it seems like she kind of settles down. And I was just hoping that it seemed like a nice tranquil kind of pause in the story, where I didn't want to imply that she's just a housewife now and is. So I do have some more stories to tell there for sure, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But again, I think THRUD's small bite-sized nature in telling it will let me fill in the cracks with THRUD in between other big projects I do. It'll be a good one to kind of pick away at, and maybe I'll have another volume in a year or two.
And do you and you see yourself going to Kickstarter again for the THRUD Volume 2 as well, I suppose? Are you going to do the same
Yeah,
format, this nice squarish format? It reminds me of CDs and like how they used to do these
yeah, I
little
think
books.
so. I've got an idea of a trilogy kind of vaguely planned out. 2 is written out. 3 is very barely thought out. But I like the idea of purple, orange, and green. Kind of stick to the palette. Do 3 books in that square format. The square format does mean that nobody's going to pick me up and actually publish these, because like Image wouldn't sell square format books. They're kind of a hard one to put on your shelf, I think, sell to the mass audience. But I think it's good for the social media, and it's kind of fun change. I think I'll be happy with this looking back in a couple of years, to have a nice little box set of the THRUD books and then move on to other projects.
Well, and the paper and colors really turn out great. Like, you, as you say,
Yeah.
you've got a really great printer that you're working with, and the it's just got it's got a very cool style. Can you talk a bit about? It's something really seemed like a weird question, but like, where'd you get this font from? It's really
Uh,
neat, interesting little font.
I've gotten a lot of mixed reviews for the font, because it is a little bit hard to read at points. It's from Blambot, and same with the title font. The title font is Destroy Earth BB, and Vengeful Gods is the interior font. Blambot is a great site for indie comic stuff. As long as you're printing an indie comic and not getting, like, even if you're making money, as long as it's an indie comic and not for a big publisher, you can use some of their fonts without a license. So it's just a great guy pouring back into the comic community, and I wanted to use exclusively his fonts. The written text font in the back of the book is one of his too, by night or something. But yeah, there's tons of great fonts for anything comic related. And like I said, he's given back to the community in a big way, in that it's all free, which is great because I have no money.
And when you do, you talked a bit about the palette. How do you actually select a palette for a story? Are you working off a master sort of palette, or are you kind of designing? Like, sometimes I don't know if you're really planning them this way, but like sometimes it seems very much like you're planning not quite spreads, but you're sort of having like the spreads sort of make sense,
Yeah,
as spreads. Like, I don't
I
know,
did
were
use
you
one
thinking about
palette
the
for
book?
the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I was. I made a rainbow palette, kind of a grid of 10 colors. Like the red I use on one page will be the same as the red in the back of the book. And then that's like left to right, the colors of the rainbow in a certain hue. And then up is white, gradient steps of 10% or 25 or something. And then down is steps of black. And so it's this grid of the rainbow, and that rainbow will be true throughout the whole book. And then I try to pick 2 or 3 colors per issue as main ones, and then the whole book as a result kind of feels nice and cohesive, even though the colors are all over the place. They feel nice and uniform because it's the same orange at the start and the back of the book. I think that really worked out.
Yeah, well, I think it turned out really, really well, and I thought the story was really interesting and as I say, it was just very fun. Like, it's a very fun, action-packed story that keeps kind of hitting you with cool little. It makes it like some nice little jokes out of the way it keeps cutting off, and cycling back, and it does, as it kind of progresses, start to cycle in tighter loops a little bit, and then as does sort of kind of hit a real climax as well. So it has a nice kind of thread and development in that sense.
I definitely appreciate hearing that, because that's the part I was least sure about. The art I was happy with, the writing I was unsure about and not self-confident. So I'm happy to hear people are liking the story. Even though I was making it up as I went along, it all seems to have worked out pretty well.
Well, what you really did, what I think was very clever, was you found a structure that accommodates making it up as you go along.
Yeah.
Like a linear structure doesn't accommodate that, unless you're in certain genres like surrealism. But
Sure.
For the most part, that it doesn't, and that nonlinear structure is hard to make work. But if you kind of pulling the Norse mythology, like I always say, like, if you find the right structure that suits the kind of story you're trying to tell, and if you figure out one that kind of fits with your strength and hides your weaknesses, in this case, your weakness of maybe not knowing how you were to handle a massive linear story is totally irrelevant. Right? And now that you kind of have figured it out, as you figured out over the course of it, it almost I mean, even like learning on the fly sort of works for the structure, because as you kind of get more control and as it gets tighter, it actually approximates narrative build towards the end of a book.
Yeah, it definitely paid off, but I was not sure it was going to in the first half. That's for sure.
Well, it's a fascinating, fun experiment. I really encourage people to pick it up. So thanks so much for talking to me. And again, if you could just remind people where they can find this book.
Another Dimension Comics in Calgary, or ZM Schuster, that's SCHUSTER, .bigcartel.com are the best places to get it for now.
Well, thanks again for talking to me. And
thanks so much
thanks
for having
me. THRUD. Have a great night.
Thank you for backing it. I appreciate the support.